Hello, dear listeners, and thank you for joining us today on the English Globe. It is always a pleasure to have you with us, wherever you may be listening from in the world. Whether you are studying at home, traveling to work, or simply relaxing and practicing your listening skills, we are happy that you have chosen to spend this time learning English with us. Our mission is very clear and simple. We help you improve your English by discussing real global events in a calm, clear, and educational way, so you can learn useful vocabulary, sentence structures, and ideas that appear in international news and everyday conversations.
Yes, welcome everyone. Today's topic comes directly from recent global news, and it has caught the attention of many people around the world. We are going to talk about why the United States captured a Russian oil tanker at sea. But very importantly, we will not discuss this topic emotionally or politically. This podcast is designed for English learners, so our focus is on understanding the situation through neutral language, simple explanations, and clear examples. You do not need to agree or disagree with anyone. You only need to listen, learn, and build your English skills step by step.
That is a very important point, Julia. When learners listen to international news, they often feel confused because the language sounds complex, formal, or even dramatic. However, global events like this are an excellent opportunity to learn how English is actually used in real-life reporting. In today's episode, we will help you understand not only what happened, but also how such events are described in professional English. You will hear neutral reporting words, cause and effect expressions, and calm explanatory phrases that you can later use in your own speaking and writing.
Exactly. Before we go deeper into the details, let's first understand why incidents at sea, especially involving oil tankers, matter so much globally. Oil tankers are not just ships. They are moving links in the global energy system. Every day, thousands of tankers travel across oceans, carrying oil that powers factories, transportation, electricity, and daily life in many countries. Because of this, sea routes are extremely important for the world economy, and any disruption or incident at sea naturally attracts international attention and discussion.
That's right. Sea routes, also called maritime trade routes, connect continents and economies. A large percentage of the world's oil and goods move through international waters, which means areas of the ocean that do not belong to any single country. Because these waters are shared by everyone, they are governed by international rules and agreements. When an incident happens in these areas, it often raises legal, economic, and security questions, which is why governments, media organizations, and global institutions pay close attention to such events.
And this is where English learners can truly benefit. News stories like this one use a specific style of language that is formal, careful, and neutral. Reporters often avoid emotional words and instead rely on facts, explanations, and official statements. By listening to this type of content, you can learn how to explain serious topics clearly and respectfully. This is especially helpful if you want to understand international news, academic discussions, or professional conversations in English.
Now, it is also important to clarify something very clearly at the beginning of this episode. This discussion is not meant to support or criticize any country, government, or political decision. Our purpose is educational. We are using this real-world event as a learning tool to help you understand vocabulary, sentence patterns, and global concepts in English. We encourage you to listen with curiosity, not judgment, and to focus on how information is presented rather than forming strong opinions while learning.
Yes, and we will guide you gently through the topic. Complex ideas will be broken down into simple explanations, and difficult terms will be explained in an easy and learner-friendly way. If you ever feel that international news is too fast or too confusing, this podcast is designed to help you slow down and understand it step by step. Think of this episode as a bridge between English learning and global awareness, where language becomes a tool for understanding the world more clearly.
Another reason this topic is useful for English learners is that it shows how cause and effect relationships are expressed in news reporting. For example, when something happens at sea, it can affect oil prices, international relations, shipping security, and market confidence. In English, these connections are often explained using linking words such as because, therefore, as a result, and due to. As you listen today, try to notice how these connectors are used naturally in conversation and explanation.
That's a great listening tip, Adam. And dear listeners, as you follow along, remember that learning English is not only about memorizing words. It is about understanding ideas and how they connect. Global events like this remind us that the world is deeply interconnected, and language helps us make sense of those connections. By learning English through real news topics, you are training your mind to think clearly, listen carefully, and communicate more confidently in international contexts.
Absolutely. So as we begin today's discussion, keep an open mind, focus on the language, and enjoy the learning process. In the next part of our podcast, we will start by clearly explaining what happened in this incident and how such events are usually described in international news reports. For now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready to explore the world through English, here on the English Globe. Now that we have set the global context, let us carefully and calmly look at what actually happened at sea, using clear facts and neutral language, because understanding the sequence of events is very important both for global awareness and for learning how international news is reported in English. According to widely reported information from official sources and international media, a Russian-linked oil tanker was stopped and detained by U.S. authorities during a maritime operation, and this action immediately became a subject of international discussion due to its connection with energy trade, maritime law, and ongoing global tensions.
Let me rephrase that in slightly simpler language for our listeners. An oil tanker that was connected to Russia was stopped while it was traveling by sea, and US forces took control of the ship for legal and security reasons that were later explained through official statements. This type of event is often described in news reports using very careful wording, because journalists usually focus on what was done, where it happened, and how authorities explained their actions rather than adding opinions or emotional language.
Before we go any further, it is helpful to clearly explain what an oil tanker actually is, because this word appears very often in international news. An oil tanker is a large commercial ship that is specifically designed to transport oil or petroleum products from one part of the world to another, usually traveling across oceans and seas for thousands of kilometers. These ships are built to carry extremely large quantities of oil safely, and because oil is such an important global resource, tankers play a central role in international trade and energy supply chains.
That explanation is very important, Adam, especially for English learners. When you hear the word tanker, it does not simply mean any ship. It refers to a highly specialized vessel with strict safety rules, international inspections, and legal responsibilities. In news reports, oil tankers are often mentioned together with words like cargo, shipment, crude oil, and energy supply. So learning this vocabulary helps you better understand articles about the global economy and international relations.
Now, let us talk about where this incident took place, because location is a key part of understanding what happened. The tanker was operating in international waters, which means the ship was sailing in parts of the sea that are not controlled by any single country. International waters are governed by international maritime law, and ships from many different nations are allowed to pass through these areas for trade and transportation as long as they follow global rules and regulations.
To make that easier to understand, international waters are like shared global roads on the ocean. No country owns them, but everyone must follow agreed rules while using them. When an incident happens in international waters, it often involves international law, cooperation between countries, and formal legal explanations. That is why reports about such events usually sound very official and careful, especially when powerful countries and valuable resources like oil are involved.
Another important point that often causes confusion is the word capture, which is sometimes used in headlines. In maritime and legal language, capture does not always mean force or conflict. It often refers to the act of stopping, detaining, or taking legal control of a vessel for investigation or enforcement purposes. In this case, the tanker was detained as part of a law enforcement operation, and the action was described using formal terms related to maritime security and compliance with regulations.
Yes, and learners should pay close attention to that vocabulary. In many news articles, you might also see the word detention, which means that a ship was held temporarily while authorities examined documents, cargo, or legal status. These words are usually written in the passive voice, such as the vessel was detained or the tanker was stopped, because news reporting often focuses on the action itself rather than on emotional descriptions of who did what.
That is an excellent observation, Julia. The passive voice is extremely common in news reporting, and this story is a perfect example. Sentences like the tanker was intercepted, the ship was escorted, or the cargo was examined allow journalists to present facts in a neutral way. For English learners, recognizing and understanding passive structures helps improve both reading comprehension and formal writing skills.
And we also see sequencing language used very clearly in reports about this event. News articles often explain events step by step, using expressions such as first, then, after that, and later. This helps listeners and readers follow the timeline without confusion. For example, reports might explain that the tanker was first identified, then approached by authorities, and later escorted for further inspection, all described in a calm and factual tone.
Exactly. This step-by-step reporting style is designed to reduce speculation and keep the focus on verified actions. Official statements usually confirm what was done and why it was done, without discussing intentions beyond legal explanations. This is why we are careful in this podcast to avoid guessing or making assumptions. We focus only on what was reported by credible sources and explained through formal channels.
From a language learning perspective, this is very valuable. You are hearing how professional English avoids dramatic language when describing serious events. Instead of saying something emotional, reports use verbs like confirmed, stated, announced, and reported. These are known as news reporting verbs, and they help create a clear distance between facts and opinions. Learning these verbs will help you sound more professional when summarizing news in English.
So, when we put everything together, we can understand the event in a clear and structured way. A Russian-linked oil tanker, which is a ship designed to transport large amounts of oil, was traveling through international waters when it was stopped and detained by U.S. authorities as part of a maritime enforcement operation. The incident was reported using neutral language, passive voice, and official explanations, which is typical for international news involving trade, security, and global law.
And for our listeners, the key takeaway from this section is not just the event itself, but how it was communicated. You have learned what an oil tanker is, what international waters mean, and how words like detained and intercepted are used in maritime reporting. You have also heard how sequencing language and passive structures help make complex events easier to understand in English.
That's right. As we move forward in this podcast, we will continue building on this foundation, slowly adding more context about laws, energy trade, and international responses, always with the goal of helping you understand both the world and the English language more clearly. For now, take a moment to reflect on how this story was explained, and notice how calm, factual language helps make even serious global events easier to follow. To truly understand why ships can sometimes be stopped at sea, we first need to understand an important difference in maritime geography, which is the difference between territorial waters and international waters, because these two areas follow different rules and are treated very differently under international law. Territorial waters are parts of the sea that are directly connected to a country, usually extending up to 12 nautical miles from its coastline, and within this zone, the country has the legal right to control security, trade, and movement, almost in the same way it controls activity on land within its borders.
Let me simplify that idea for our listeners. Territorial waters are like a country's front yard in the ocean. The country can decide who enters, who leaves, and what activities are allowed there. If a ship enters territorial waters, it must follow that country's national laws, and authorities can stop or inspect the ship if they believe rules are being broken. This definition is very important because many misunderstandings about maritime incidents come from not knowing where exactly an event took place.
Now, when we move beyond territorial waters, we enter what are called international waters, also known as the high seas, and these areas are not owned or controlled by any single country. International waters exist beyond national boundaries, and they are shared by all nations for navigation, trade, and communication. Because no country owns these waters, special international rules exist to make sure that ships from different countries can operate safely and fairly without constant conflict or confusion.
In simpler terms, international waters are like public roads that belong to everyone. Ships from many countries can travel there, but they still have to follow agreed global rules. These rules are not made by one government. Instead, they are created through international agreements so that all countries understand what is allowed and what is not allowed. This is where maritime law becomes very important, especially when ships carry valuable cargo like oil or gas.
Maritime law, which is sometimes called the law of the sea, is a collection of international rules and agreements that explain how countries and ships should behave on the oceans. One of the most important agreements in this area is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which helps define where territorial waters end, where international waters begin, and what rights and responsibilities countries have at sea. This legal framework exists to reduce conflict and provide clear guidance when incidents happen.
For English learners, it is helpful to focus on key legal vocabulary here. Words like jurisdiction, enforcement, compliance, and regulation often appear in reports about maritime law. Jurisdiction refers to legal authority. Enforcement means making sure rules are followed, compliance means obeying rules, and regulations are official rules themselves. Understanding these words can make international news much easier to follow and less confusing.
Now, an important question many learners ask is this: if international waters belong to everyone, why can ships still be stopped or inspected there? The answer is that while international waters are shared, ships themselves operate under what is called a flag state. This means every ship is registered to a specific country, and that country is responsible for making sure the ship follows international rules, safety standards, and legal requirements.
So, to put it simply, even though the ocean does not belong to one country, the ship does belong to a country through registration. That registration gives the ship a nationality, just like people have nationalities. Because of this, ships must follow international rules, and in certain situations, they can be inspected, they may be questioned, or they must stop if there is a serious legal reason, such as safety concerns or violations of international agreements.
This is where modal verbs become very important in legal English. When we say a ship can be inspected, it means inspection is possible under specific rules. When we say a ship may be stopped, it suggests permission or legal allowance under certain conditions. And when we say a ship must comply, it shows obligation, meaning the ship has no choice but to follow the rule. News reports carefully use these modal verbs to avoid exaggeration or misunderstanding.
Yes, and journalists choose these words very carefully. For example, instead of saying authorities stopped a ship because they wanted to, reports usually explain that a ship may be detained if regulations are not followed, or must be inspected if safety standards require it. These phrases show that actions are based on rules, not emotions. As learners, noticing these small language choices can greatly improve your understanding of formal English.
Another key point is that inspections at sea are often connected to safety, environmental protection, or international agreements. Ships carrying oil, for example, can be inspected to ensure they are not leaking, violating safety standards, or breaking trade regulations. These inspections are meant to protect the ocean, global trade, and human life, rather than to target a specific country or company without reason.
This is why reports often include phrases like, according to international law or under existing regulations. These phrases explain that actions are guided by rules that already exist. They also help keep reporting neutral. Instead of blaming or accusing, the language focuses on procedures, responsibilities, and legal frameworks. For English learners, this shows how serious topics can be discussed calmly and professionally.
So, when we connect all these ideas together, we can understand maritime law as a system designed to balance freedom and responsibility. Ships are free to travel across international waters, but they also have responsibilities to follow safety rules, environmental protections, and legal agreements. When authorities believe these responsibilities are not being met, ships can be inspected or detained according to established legal processes.
And the most important lesson for our listeners is that these rules exist to create order in a very large and shared space. The oceans cover most of our planet, and without maritime law, global trade would be chaotic and unsafe. By learning these concepts in English, you are not only improving your language skills, but also gaining a deeper understanding of how the world works behind the headlines.
Exactly. As we move forward in this podcast, remember that understanding the language of law and rules does not require legal training. It simply requires patience, clear explanations, and practice. In the next section, we will look more closely at why oil tankers, in particular, attract so much attention in global affairs, and why energy transport plays such a powerful role in international discussions. For now, take a moment to review the key ideas you learned today, and notice how modal verbs and definitions helped explain complex concepts in a simple way. To understand why oil tankers receive so much attention in global news, we first need to understand the role oil plays in the world economy, because oil is not just another product that is bought and sold. It is one of the main energy sources that keeps modern life running smoothly across almost every country. Oil is used to produce fuel for cars, ships, and airplanes. It supports manufacturing and industrial production, and it plays a key role in electricity generation in many parts of the world, which means that when oil supply is affected, many areas of daily life can also be affected at the same time.
That connection is very important for learners to understand. When people hear news about oil, they sometimes think it only affects governments or large companies. But in reality, oil influences everyday experiences, such as the price of transportation, the cost of goods in stores, and even the availability of certain services. For example, when fuel prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive, and businesses often pass those costs on to consumers, which shows how global energy systems are closely connected to personal daily life.
Because oil is so central to the global economy, the transportation of oil must be carefully organized and monitored to ensure stability and safety. Oil tankers move millions of barrels of oil across oceans every day, connecting oil-producing regions with oil-consuming countries, and any interruption along these routes can create uncertainty in energy markets. This is why oil shipments are tracked, inspected, and sometimes discussed in international forums, as governments want to reduce risks that could disrupt supply or cause economic instability.
In simpler language, oil shipments are monitored because too many people depend on them. If a tanker is delayed, damaged, or stopped unexpectedly, it can affect supply chains and market confidence. Words like supply, demand, price stability, and market reaction are often used in reports about oil transport. And learning these terms helps English learners understand how energy news is connected to economic behavior. These words are part of the everyday language of global business and international reporting.
Another important idea is energy security, which refers to a country's ability to access reliable and affordable energy sources over the long term. Many countries do not produce enough oil themselves and must import it from other regions, which means they depend on secure shipping routes and stable international relationships. When energy supply feels uncertain, governments often review transportation routes, shipping regulations, and partnerships to protect their economies from sudden disruptions.
Energy security might sound like a technical term, but it affects daily life in very real ways. If a country struggles to secure enough energy, factories may slow down, transportation systems may become more expensive, and households may face higher utility costs. That is why governments pay close attention to oil transport and why oil tankers are often mentioned in discussions about economic planning and long-term stability. For learners, this is a great example of how abstract economic terms connect directly to everyday experiences.
Because of this importance, oil tankers are sometimes described as moving parts of the global energy system rather than just ships. Their routes, schedules, and safety standards are all part of a complex network that supports international trade. This network depends on trust, rules, and cooperation between countries, shipping companies, and international organizations. When any part of this system faces pressure, it can lead to increased monitoring and careful decision-making.
This is why news reports often use careful explanation structures when discussing oil transport. Instead of blaming or accusing, journalists usually explain what happened, why it matters economically, and how it could affect markets or energy supply. You may notice phrases like this is important because this affects global markets by, or this can influence prices, which are common structures used to explain economic relationships in clear and neutral English.
It is also important to understand that oil tankers are monitored not only for economic reasons, but also for safety and environmental protection. Oil spills can cause serious damage to marine ecosystems and coastal communities, so strict rules exist to ensure that tankers follow safety standards. These inspections and regulations are designed to reduce risk and protect shared global resources, which is another reason why oil transport is treated as a matter of international concern rather than a private activity.
For English learners, this section introduces many useful economy-related words such as trade, transportation, supply chain, consumption, and infrastructure. These words appear frequently in news, academic discussions, and professional settings. By learning them in context, you can better understand how global events influence local realities, and you can also use these terms when talking about economics, business, or international issues in English.
When we connect all these ideas together, it becomes clear why oil tankers are strategically important without needing to focus on political arguments or speculation. Oil supports the global economy, oil shipments keep energy moving across borders, and energy security helps countries plan for stable growth. Because of these factors, oil transport naturally becomes part of international discussions and careful monitoring, especially during times of uncertainty.
And the key lesson for our listeners is that global economic systems are closely connected to daily life, even if we do not always notice it. When you hear news about oil tankers, energy routes, or shipping incidents, you are really hearing about the systems that support modern living. Understanding this language allows you to follow global news with more confidence and to see how international events can influence ordinary experiences such as travel, shopping, and work.
Exactly. As we continue this podcast, we will keep building your understanding step by step, using clear language and real examples. In the next section, we will explore how trade rules and sanctions can affect shipping and why enforcement sometimes happens at sea, always with the goal of helping you improve your English while understanding the world more clearly. To continue our discussion in a clear and educational way, we now need to understand the idea of sanctions, because this word appears very often in international news, especially when topics like trade, shipping, and energy are discussed. Sanctions are official measures or restrictions that countries or international organizations place on another country, company, or group in order to limit certain activities, such as trade, financial transactions, or access to specific resources, and these measures are usually introduced through legal processes rather than through direct force.
Let me simplify that explanation for our listeners. Sanctions are rules that say what cannot be done or what must be limited in international trade or cooperation. They are usually written into laws or agreements and are announced publicly, so that companies, banks, and shipping operators know what is allowed and what is restricted. This makes sanctions very different from sudden actions or personal decisions, because they are part of an organized legal framework.
One important thing to understand is that sanctions are not designed to affect ordinary people directly, but rather to influence behavior at a government or organizational level by changing economic conditions. In practice, sanctions often focus on industries such as energy, banking, or transportation, because these sectors play a major role in national economies. When sanctions are introduced, companies involved in these sectors must adjust their operations to remain in compliance with international and domestic laws.
For English learners, this is a good moment to focus on abstract nouns, which are very common in discussions about sanctions. Words like restriction, compliance, enforcement, regulation, and authorization describe ideas rather than physical objects, and they help explain how systems work. These abstract nouns allow speakers to discuss complex rules in a formal and professional way, which is typical in legal and economic English.
Now, let us look at how sanctions affect shipping, especially when goods like oil are involved. When sanctions limit the sale or transport of certain products, shipping companies must carefully check where cargo comes from, where it is going, and who is involved in the transaction. This means that documentation, registration, and payment methods become very important, because any mistake could result in legal penalties or financial loss.
In simpler terms, shipping becomes more complicated under sanctions. A tanker cannot simply travel from one port to another without careful planning. Operators must make sure the cargo is allowed, the route is permitted, and the buyers and sellers are legally approved. Vocabulary such as shipment, cargo, destination, authorization, and verification is often used in this context. And learning these words helps listeners understand how trade rules affect real-world movement of goods.
Because sanctions are legal measures, governments are responsible for enforcement, which means making sure the rules are followed. Enforcement does not always happen on land or in offices. Sometimes it happens at sea because that is where trade physically takes place. When ships carry restricted goods or operate under unclear legal conditions, maritime authorities may intervene to inspect documents, confirm cargo details, or temporarily detain vessels for further review.
This is why enforcement at sea is often described using formal and careful language. Reports usually say that a ship was inspected, was detained, or was subject to enforcement action, rather than using emotional or dramatic terms. These phrases show that the actions are part of a legal process. For learners, recognizing this formal structure helps reduce confusion and makes it easier to follow serious news topics in English.
Another key point is that enforcement at sea is not random. It is usually based on intelligence, documentation, or regulatory requirements. Authorities do not stop ships simply because of nationality. They act because certain conditions suggest that a rule may not be followed. This distinction is important because it shows that enforcement is connected to systems and procedures, not personal decisions or political emotions.
Yes, and this is where legal and economic vocabulary work together. Words like jurisdiction, investigation, authority, and procedure explain who has the right to act and how actions are carried out. These words help keep communication clear and professional. For English learners, learning how these terms are used together builds confidence when listening to formal discussions or reading international news articles.
Sanctions also influence global markets because they change the flow of goods and money. When certain products become restricted, companies may look for alternative suppliers, new routes, or different payment systems. This adjustment process can create uncertainty, which markets often react to quickly. However, news reporting usually explains these effects carefully, using neutral language to describe trends rather than predictions.
This is another opportunity for learners to observe formal English in action. Phrases such as a result of, in accordance with, and under existing regulations are often used to connect sanctions with their economic effects. These expressions help explain cause and effect in a structured way, which is very useful for academic writing and professional communication.
When we connect all these ideas, we can see sanctions as part of a broader system of international trade rules. They influence shipping by setting limits. They require enforcement to remain effective, and they rely on legal language to remain clear and consistent. Understanding this system helps explain why maritime incidents sometimes occur without assuming conflict or hostility.
And for our listeners, the most important takeaway is that sanctions are about rules, not emotions. They operate through laws, documents, inspections, and formal communication. By learning the vocabulary and structures used to describe sanctions, you are improving your ability to understand complex global topics in English while staying focused on education rather than opinion.
Exactly. In the next section, we will look at how official government statements explain actions at sea and how countries present their positions using careful, formal language. As always, our goal is to help you learn English through real-world topics in a clear, calm, and educational way. To understand the U.S. perspective on incidents at sea, it is important to focus on how official explanations are usually presented, because governments tend to communicate through carefully prepared statements that rely on formal language, legal references, and security-related terms rather than emotional expressions or personal opinions. In reports related to maritime enforcement, U.S. authorities typically explain their actions by referring to existing laws, international obligations, and the responsibility to maintain safety and order in areas connected to global trade and energy transport.
In simpler words, the US usually says that its actions are based on rules, not feelings. Officials often explain that they are following laws and agreements that already exist, and they describe their role as protecting security, enforcing regulations, and ensuring that international trade operates within legal boundaries. When learners listen to these explanations, it helps to remember that this is a formal style of communication designed to explain actions clearly and responsibly.
According to official statements, actions taken at sea are often described as part of routine enforcement or monitoring activities, especially when ships are connected to sensitive sectors like energy or international shipping. The U.S. has explained in similar cases that maritime operations are conducted to verify compliance with applicable regulations, to prevent illegal activities, and to support broader efforts aimed at maintaining stability in international waters. This type of language focuses on procedure rather than intention.
For English learners, it is useful to notice how indirect speech is used here. Instead of directly quoting officials, news reports often say that authorities stated that, explained that, or confirmed that certain actions were taken. This reporting style helps journalists summarize official positions without adding interpretation, and it allows listeners to understand the message while keeping the tone neutral and factual.
Another key part of the U.S. explanation usually involves security considerations, which are described in broad and general terms. Officials often refer to the need to protect shipping lanes, prevent unauthorized activities, and ensure that international rules are respected by all parties. These explanations avoid specific accusations and instead highlight the responsibility of law enforcement agencies to act when legal or safety concerns are identified.
To make this easier to understand, security language often sounds general on purpose. Words like risk, threat, prevention, and protection are used without dramatic detail. This helps maintain calm communication and avoids unnecessary tension. For learners, recognizing this pattern makes it easier to understand official statements without feeling overwhelmed by complex or emotional language.
The U.S. perspective also emphasizes that enforcement actions are not directed at individuals or national identities, but are connected to activities and compliance with rules. Official explanations often clarify that decisions are based on information, documentation, or regulatory frameworks rather than political disagreement. This distinction is important because it shows how formal reasoning is presented in international law enforcement contexts.
In simpler English, the message is usually that actions were taken because certain rules needed to be checked or enforced, not because of opinions about a country. Vocabulary such as compliance, authorization, inspection, and investigation helps explain this reasoning. These words appear frequently in legal and security-related English, so learning them is very useful for understanding global news.
Another common feature of official communication is the use of careful, structured sentences that explain responsibility. For example, reports may say that authorities were required to act or were authorized under existing law. These phrases show obligation and permission without emotion. They also help explain why certain actions can take place within international frameworks.
Yes, and this is where formal vocabulary becomes especially important. Words like mandate, framework, enforcement mechanism, and oversight are often used in official explanations. While these words may sound complex at first, they simply describe systems that guide decisions. Understanding them helps learners follow discussions about government policy and international cooperation more easily.
When the U.S. explains actions at sea, it also often mentions cooperation with international partners and institutions. This highlights that maritime enforcement is rarely a single-country effort and usually involves coordination based on shared rules. This type of explanation reinforces the idea that actions are part of an established system rather than sudden or isolated decisions.
For learners, this shows how formal English can sound polite, careful, and structured, even when discussing serious topics. Instead of strong language, officials rely on phrases like, in accordance with, under existing agreements, and as part of ongoing efforts. These expressions help connect actions to rules and policies, which is a key feature of professional communication.
When we look at the U.S. perspective as a whole, we see a consistent focus on rules, security, and policy. The language used aims to explain actions through law and responsibility, not through emotion or persuasion. This approach is common in official statements and is important for maintaining clarity and stability in international communication.
And for our listeners, the main lesson is how to understand and interpret formal explanations in English. By learning how official positions are reported and summarized, you become better prepared to read news articles, listen to briefings, and understand global discussions. In the next section, we will look at how other international actors respond to such events and how diplomatic language is used to express different viewpoints in a calm and respectful way.
After an incident at sea is reported and one country explains its actions, the next important step in global communication is how other countries respond. Because international relations rely heavily on words, tone, and carefully chosen language rather than immediate actions. In this case, Russia's response, like many diplomatic reactions, was delivered through official statements that focused on legal interpretation, national interests, and formal concerns, using language designed to express a position without increasing tension or creating unnecessary conflict.
In simpler terms, governments usually respond with calm and measured words. Instead of emotional reactions, they use formal sentences to explain how they see the situation. For English learners, this is a good example of diplomatic English, which is polite, indirect, and very careful. Words are chosen not only to communicate information, but also to maintain respect and avoid misunderstandings between countries.
Russian officials, according to public statements, expressed their position by referring to international law and maritime principles, explaining that they were reviewing the situation through legal and diplomatic channels. This type of response is common in international affairs, where governments often state that they are seeking clarification, monitoring developments, or evaluating the legal basis of an action, rather than making strong accusations or immediate demands.
Notice how those phrases sound very neutral. Expressions like seeking clarification or monitoring developments allow a country to show concern without sounding aggressive. This is an important skill in English communication. When you want to disagree politely, you do not say, "This is wrong," but instead you might say, "We have concerns," or "We are reviewing the matter." These phrases reduce tension and keep communication open.
Beyond Russia's response, other countries also reacted in a similar diplomatic style, often through ministries of foreign affairs or official spokespersons. These reactions usually avoided taking sides directly and instead emphasized the importance of international law, freedom of navigation, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Such statements reflect a common approach in global diplomacy, where stability and dialogue are prioritized over confrontation.
For learners, this shows how international reactions are often expressed using neutral reaction phrases. You may hear sentences like countries called for restraint, officials emphasized dialogue, or leaders urged respect for international rules. These phrases do not express strong emotions. Instead, they show concern while encouraging calm discussion. Learning these expressions helps you understand global news without feeling overwhelmed.
International organizations also play an important role in these situations, especially when events involve shared spaces like international waters. Organizations connected to maritime law, trade, or global cooperation often remind all parties of existing agreements and encourage communication through established legal frameworks. Their role is not to take sides, but to support dialogue and consistency in how rules are applied.
This is another example of very formal and neutral English. International organizations often use phrases such as reaffirmed their commitment, encouraged cooperation, or highlighted the importance of established norms. These expressions may sound complex, but they simply mean that rules already exist and should be followed. Recognizing this vocabulary makes international reports much easier to understand.
Diplomatic language also relies heavily on indirect speech and careful wording. Instead of saying, "We disagree," officials might say that they expressed reservations or raised questions about an action. This style allows countries to communicate differences without damaging relationships. It is a key feature of international communication and an important skill for advanced English learners to recognize.
Yes, and this polite disagreement language is useful beyond politics. In professional and academic settings, English speakers often disagree in the same indirect way. Phrases like, "We see the situation differently," or "We would like to discuss certain aspects," help keep conversations respectful. Learning this language helps you sound more confident and professional in many situations.
When we look at global reactions as a whole, we can see a pattern. Governments explain their views through formal statements. International organizations encourage calm and cooperation, and media reports summarize these responses using neutral language. This process shows how communication helps manage international situations without immediate escalation.
And for our listeners, the main lesson from this section is how words matter in global communication. By understanding diplomatic English, polite disagreement, and neutral reaction phrases, you become better prepared to follow international news and to express your own ideas calmly and respectfully in English. In the next section, we will explore how events like this can influence global markets and shipping, and how economic language is used to describe those effects.
Now, in this section, we are going to talk about how an incident at sea, like the detention of an oil tanker, can affect global oil markets and international shipping, and we will explain this slowly and clearly because this topic can sound complex, but the basic ideas are actually quite simple when we break them down step by step and connect them to everyday experiences that all of us can understand. When news appears about a ship being stopped or inspected, especially when that ship is carrying oil, markets often react very quickly, not because people know exactly what will happen next, but because uncertainty itself creates concern, and in economics, uncertainty often leads to changes in prices, behavior, and decision-making. When traders, companies, and governments hear that an oil shipment has been delayed, inspected, or detained, they start to ask important questions, such as whether more ships might be affected, whether deliveries will arrive on time, and whether supply could become tighter in the short term. And even if the answers are not clear, the mere possibility of disruption can influence how people act in the market. This is why oil prices sometimes move even when the physical supply of oil has not actually changed yet, because markets often respond to expectations and risks, not only to real shortages.
Let me simplify that idea a little for our listeners. Imagine you are waiting for an important package, and suddenly you hear news that delivery trucks in your area might be delayed because of inspections or road problems. Even if your package is still on the way, you may start to worry, and that worry can change how you plan your day. And in the same way, oil traders react to news before they know the final outcome. This is why we often hear the phrase market uncertainty, which means that people in the market are not sure what will happen next. And when uncertainty increases, prices can move up or down very quickly. A useful phrase here is the market reacted to the news, which is common in economic reporting. And another helpful expression is prices responded to uncertainty, both of which are neutral ways to describe what happens without making predictions or taking sides.
Another important part of this topic is shipping insurance and transportation costs, which play a major role in global trade, but are often invisible to everyday consumers. When ships travel through areas that are seen as risky, insurance companies may increase the cost of insuring those ships because higher risk usually means higher insurance premiums, and when insurance becomes more expensive, shipping companies often pass those costs on to buyers and sellers through higher transportation fees. This means that even a single incident can have wider economic effects, because if shipping costs rise, the price of transporting oil and other goods can increase, and when transportation becomes more expensive, the final price paid by consumers may also rise, even if the original product itself has not changed. This is an important example of cause and effect language, where one event leads to another, and we can describe it clearly by saying, because shipping risks increased, insurance costs rose, and as a result, transportation became more expensive.
To help learners notice the language here, listen to how Adam used linking phrases like because, as a result. And this means that, which are very common in economic explanations and are extremely useful when you want to explain relationships between events. Another helpful structure is the conditional sentence. For example, if shipping becomes more risky, insurance costs may increase, which shows a possible result without stating it as a certainty. You will often hear sentences like, if uncertainty continues, markets may remain unstable. And this type of sentence is useful because it allows speakers to explain possible outcomes while staying neutral and factual, which is very important in news and educational content.
Now let us talk briefly about why traders react so quickly to news, even when details are limited. Traders work in an environment where timing is very important, and they often make decisions based on incomplete information because waiting too long can mean missing opportunities or facing losses. When news about shipping disruptions appears, traders may buy or sell oil contracts as a protective measure, not because they believe a crisis is certain, but because they want to reduce risk in case the situation becomes more serious. This behavior does not necessarily mean that a long-term shortage will happen, but it does show how sensitive global markets are to transportation and security concerns, especially when it comes to energy resources like oil, which are deeply connected to many parts of the global economy, including transportation, manufacturing, and electricity generation.
In simple words, we can say that markets do not like surprises. And when something unexpected happens, people react first and analyze later. And that is why news headlines often have an immediate effect on prices. A very useful phrase here is markets responded cautiously, which suggests careful behavior rather than panic. And another helpful expression is investors adjusted their expectations, which means people changed how they thought about the future based on new information. For learners, these phrases are common in financial and economic news, and understanding them can help you follow international stories with more confidence and less confusion.
To summarize this section, incidents at sea can influence global oil markets and shipping even without causing physical damage or long-term disruption, because markets respond to risk, uncertainty, and potential delays, and these reactions can affect prices, insurance costs, and shipping decisions. By understanding these basic connections, learners can better see how a single event can create economic effects that reach far beyond the location where the incident occurred.
And from a language learning point of view, this section helps you practice market-related verbs like react, respond, increase, and affect, as well as conditional sentences and cause and effect structures, which are essential tools for talking about economics and global events in clear, calm, and professional English.
Dear listeners, this section is all about how you can learn English from global news, using today's incident as an example. One of the most important lessons is observing how professional media presents events using neutral and precise language. Words like detained, inspected, compliance, enforcement, and response are repeated across different contexts to describe actions factually, without expressing judgment or opinion. By noticing these words, learners can focus on the actual information, understand sequences of events clearly, and follow complex reports while maintaining a neutral perspective, which is essential for understanding professional English and international communication.
Absolutely, Adam. Another key skill for learners is developing listening strategies for long and detailed content, which can often feel overwhelming at first. Breaking the information into smaller sections, identifying key vocabulary, and summarizing main ideas after each part can make the learning process easier. For instance, when we discussed sanctions or market reactions, you could pause and ask yourself, what happened? Who is involved? Why does it matter? This approach improves comprehension, strengthens memory, and gives learners a practical method to follow long podcasts, news reports, and educational discussions in English effectively and with confidence.
In addition, learners can focus on the sentence structures used throughout this podcast, which are typical in professional news and academic English. Cause and effect connectors, like as a result, because of. This means that allow speakers to clearly link events and consequences. Conditional sentences, such as if shipping becomes more risky, insurance costs may increase, show possible outcomes without assuming certainty. By observing and practicing these structures, learners gain tools to both understand English explanations and express complex ideas themselves, which is particularly useful for writing summaries, academic exercises, and professional discussions in English.
Another important takeaway is the use of indirect speech and reporting verbs, which help maintain clarity and neutrality. Words and phrases like officials stated that, authorities explained that, or leaders emphasized that allow speakers to convey information from others accurately and respectfully. Learning how to use reporting verbs in your own sentences enables you to summarize news or academic content effectively. It also allows you to maintain a professional and polite tone, which which is important not only for following global events, but also in business, teaching, and formal English communication.
Finally, one of the most valuable lessons for learners is vocabulary expansion in context. We introduce terms related to maritime law, energy, trade, and diplomacy, which appear frequently in international reporting. By hearing these words repeated in natural sentences, you can understand their meaning, observe their grammatical patterns, and remember them more easily. Contextual learning like this is much more effective than memorizing words alone, because you see exactly how words are used in real-life discussions, which builds both understanding and confidence when listening to news, reading articles, or speaking about global events in English.
Confidence is central to language learning, and long discussions like this one provide excellent practice. At first, following all the details might feel challenging, but repeated listening, note-taking, and summarizing help you improve steadily. Each time you identify neutral vocabulary, observe sentence patterns, and connect cause and effect ideas, you are strengthening your ability to understand and communicate in English. With consistent practice, learners not only gain comprehension skills, but also develop the confidence to discuss international topics fluently, making it easier to engage with professional news sources and educational content in English.
In summary, this event teaches English learners several key skills: how to interpret neutral vocabulary, how to follow detailed explanations, and how to summarize and report information accurately. By paying attention to formal structures, indirect speech, and cause and effect connectors, learners can improve both listening and speaking abilities. Global news provides a rich source of authentic English in context, and by approaching it methodically, you can strengthen comprehension, expand vocabulary, and gain confidence, preparing you to understand future international events and discuss them clearly in English.
So, dear listeners, remember that every news story, including this incident at sea, is not just a report about world events, it is also an opportunity to practice English in a real context. By focusing on neutral language, formal structures, and clear cause and effect explanations, you build a solid foundation for professional comprehension. Keep practicing, summarize what you hear, repeat key phrases, and notice how words are used in different contexts. Over time, these strategies will help you follow long-form English content more comfortably, understand complex topics, and communicate confidently about global issues in English.
Dear listeners, as we reach the end of today's podcast, it is important to reflect on what we have learned, both in terms of global events and English language skills. Throughout this episode, we explored the capture of a Russian oil tanker at sea, discussed sanctions, maritime law, and market reactions, and highlighted how countries communicate in formal, neutral language. From a language perspective, you practiced passive voice, cause and effect connectors, reporting verbs, and diplomatic phrases. These are essential tools for understanding news, summarizing information, and expressing ideas clearly and professionally in English.
Exactly, Adam. I want to remind our listeners that this podcast is strictly educational. We are not giving political opinions or taking sides. Instead, we are analyzing global news as a way to improve English comprehension and vocabulary. By listening to formal statements, neutral reporting language, and diplomatic phrasing, you can develop skills that help you read articles, follow news broadcasts, and understand complex discussions without feeling confused or overwhelmed. Education and language learning are the main goals, and your focus should remain on English, not political debate.
One key takeaway for learners is the importance of neutral vocabulary when discussing sensitive topics. Words like detained, inspected, compliance, response, enforcement, and monitoring were used consistently to describe actions factually, without emotion or judgment. Recognizing these terms and their usage will help you follow international news more confidently. Additionally, linking phrases such as a result, because of, and this means that were highlighted throughout this episode. They allow you to explain connections between events clearly, which is essential in professional and academic English.
Another important learning point is understanding cause and effect relationships and conditional statements. For example, we practiced sentences like, if shipping becomes more risky, insurance costs may increase, which show how possibilities lead to consequences. Conditional sentences and cause and effect language are commonly used in international reporting, economics, and business English. By noticing these patterns and practicing them, you can describe complex situations accurately and professionally, which strengthens both your speaking and writing skills while keeping communication clear and respectful.
We also emphasized listening strategies for long-form news content, which is very useful for learners at any level. Breaking down information into smaller segments, summarizing key points, and noting new vocabulary allows you to understand detailed discussions without feeling overwhelmed. Practicing these techniques regularly builds comprehension, memory retention, and confidence, enabling you to follow podcasts, news articles, or lectures in English more effectively. Over time, these skills allow you to engage with international topics critically while improving your language fluency.
Finally, I want to encourage all listeners to continue exploring global topics as a way to learn English. Listening to real-world news, analyzing vocabulary, and observing sentence structures provide authentic language practice that cannot be replicated in textbooks alone. Remember to focus on understanding, reflecting on content, and summarizing it in your own words. These strategies improve comprehension and allow you to communicate complex ideas more clearly. Learning English through global events strengthens both language skills and awareness of the interconnected world around you.
Before we close, it is important to remind everyone that this podcast is intended for educational purposes only. All information shared is based on verified news sources and neutral reporting. We do not provide investment advice, legal counsel, or political recommendations. Our goal is to help you improve English through meaningful content while understanding global events in a neutral and professional manner. Maintaining neutrality ensures that learning remains safe, monetization-friendly, and aligned with YouTube's policies, allowing us to continue providing high-quality educational content.
Thank you so much for joining us today, dear listeners. Keep practicing English by listening carefully, taking notes, and repeating key vocabulary and phrases. Remember, every global news story is also a language lesson if you approach it thoughtfully. Stay curious, observe neutral language, and develop your ability to summarize, reflect, and communicate ideas clearly. We hope today's episode has boosted your confidence, expanded your vocabulary, and inspired you to continue learning English through international events. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and stay engaged with the world in English.